Welcome everyone. I'm Donna Smith and I'm co-chair of the PSA Teaching and Learning Network. I work at the Open University. Welcome to the third PSA webinar series. This series focuses on general teaching and learning issues as well as online learning, following on from the spring and summer series which focused exclusively on online learning. Today's session is on active learning, led by Cristina Leston-Bandeira from the University of Leeds. And this session will reflect on why Cristina has found active learning yields the most benefits when it comes to teaching politics, and she'll share some examples of practice and tips to employ both online and face-to-face. We're due to finish in about an hour's time, and there will be time for questions. I'll be moderating the chat box, so please do post your questions there. Please note this session is recorded and make sure you're muted for now. Without further ado, please welcome Cristina.
Thank you very much, Donna, and hello everyone, and nice to see some familiar faces, although I'm not seeing many faces, I'm just seeing names, in some cases photos. Hi Simon, thank you. It's like being in a seminar, isn't it, and all the students put their cameras off and then suddenly you're talking to just some icons. So thank you. Anyone's put their cameras on would be much appreciated, because I'm a very visual person and I like to talk to faces. So when Donna asked me if I would do another seminar on teaching online learning, and I thought, oh, another one, because we all have so much on, and I'm sure the feeling is the same for everyone. And I said, okay, I'll do one, as long as it's really simple, just basically talking about some of the stuff that I do. So what I'm going to do is exactly that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about active learning, simply because it's an approach that I've used for over 20 years, 30 years, and it's something which I feel very comfortable with. I think it's worked really well for my teaching. I'm not an expert by any means. I've got Simon Ashwood there, who also has written a lot about active learning and has got his own site on active learning, and I'm definitely not an expert. So I'm just going to talk through some of the things that I do and some examples, and you're very welcome to ask questions. It might be easier, just for the sake of presentation, to do it at the end. I'll try not to go on for too long. But if there's anything that I'm going through that you want to know more about, then ask me, and then we can always go back to it, if that's okay. Yeah, cool. So I'm going to share my screen now. So can you see my screen now? You should see a slide with a photo of my lovely students. I can see John nodding, so I'll assume everyone can see it. So in this photo, in this slide here, is just a photo of some of my students with a talk that Hilary Ben came to do to them. He's our local MP, and it's just an example of some of the ways I try to integrate the politics, the reality of politics, into my teaching. But I mean, active learning actually includes so many different things. It's not just about bringing the reality of politics or reality out there to your teaching. And as I said before, and I'm sure many of you know about this, there's whole books and articles written about it. But to put it simply, I see active learning as learning through doing, learning through being active literally by moving about, and I'll show you some examples where I basically make my students actually move about in a classroom, more difficult to do online, to things like experiencing a situation, trying to put them in scenarios. So it can include many different things, but ultimately it's about an approach to teaching that flips it onto the student and focuses the whole learning experience onto the student rather than the delivery. So it's not about us, it's not about the delivery, and being recipient to that delivery is to make the students experience more that process of learning. And that can be by just making them stand up and walk about in the room. It can be by them having to think a particular problem to resolve. And it can be something very simple and something very complex. So it encompasses lots of different things. And I hope that with my examples, you can see some of that. And why active learning to teach politics? I think it suits politics so well, because our discipline is ever changing every day. It's a very fast pace. Every day there's something to talk about in politics. And there's so many different dimensions to it. And people often see politics as just the politicians and see something as detached from them. And I'm sure you've all had experience of trying to convey to students, actually politics is everything that happens in society. And so through active learning, it's about making our students engage in a direct way with those aspects of politics, whether it's in my area, I teach a lot about parliament, where it's about parliament, whether it's about international politics, say what's happening now in Myanmar, whatever it may be, it's always there. And there's so many outputs that we can use from politics. It's a great approach to develop employability skills. So as you'll see from the examples that I'll show, a lot of the things that I do are thinking about different types of skills that students will have to then use in their jobs, from problem solving, team player, all of those things, besides just your more academic skills such as critical thinking and analysis. So there's lots of reasons why it suits really well politics, and it makes also the teaching more engaging, I think, because it's about getting them involved into that side of things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at how, this is really just examples. And so I'm going to show you how, I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples I've done, they're used for lectures, they're used for seminars, and also about assessment after. And I'm sure some of the examples I'm going to talk about, many of you use, others you might use different versions. So this is just some things that came to mind. So with lectures, and this, I would say, it's exactly the same online or face-to-face. I haven't used the approach of recording my lectures. I do my lectures online live, and I use all of these techniques in my online lectures too. And it's about flipping the delivery of the lecture, rather than being a passive element where someone is delivering a lecture to you and you're supposedly listening to it, which we all know is really difficult to maintain for a very long time, definitely over than 15 minutes. It's about flipping that onto the student. And there's very simple ways of doing it. So just asking a question, just asking a simple question, like very quick example, I show a graph of trust in Parliament, and there's a big dip in 2009. And my students doing the UK Parliament module should have an idea about the expense scandal. So I might ask them, any idea why we have the trust going down in 2009? And always there'll be one or two, they'll say expense scandal. So it's a way of just involving them and holding the attention. It's about flipping, again, the teaching to the learning, to the student. Using polls, there's lots of different tools to use that. Universities have their own tools. There's things like Menti, there's things like Top Hat. I'm sure your universities will have something. There's many free things that can be used that are available out there. And just asking them questions where the whole class can actually vote on that, or can give their views, and can be a really engaging way of involving the students. And particularly if you have a very large class, it works really well. And then just things like changing the tone. So rather than just having 10 minutes, 15 minutes, solid 20 minutes of just you speaking, is about changing the tone, looking at an external web link, so going away from the screen and looking at something else, playing a video, whatever that may be. It's about that, again, that moving, changing the passivity of learning. Another thing that I do quite a bit is a quick quiz type of question. You've got a slide there, an example of one of my quizzes, and this is for first year lecture on comparative politics. And I often use this, I give them 4 pictures of 4 things or 4 people and ask them the odd one out of the 4. And this is a question about, this is a lecture about executives, and I'm teaching them about presidential and semi-presidential. And I'll ask you now, which one do you think is the odd one out? So we've got 4 presidents of 4 different countries: Ellen Johnson from Liberia, Dilma Rousseff from Brazil, Joko Widodo from Indonesia, and Macron for France. And if anyone knows what the odd one out is, then you can write in the chat. The odd one out, I'll tell you though, is Macron, because it's a semi-presidential system and he's not the head of the executive, he's the head of the state. So very simple example on how to use a quick quiz. And again, it's about making the students think in a different way, rather than just being passive learners. That idea right at the end of the slide, emoticons for ideas, that is specifically for online teaching. And again, it's about making the students think about what you're doing. They're not just receiving your delivery, they're also having to think and asking them, what emoticon would you use for Parliament, for instance? What emoticon would you use for the US? What emoticon would you use for liberalism? And it's amazing what students can come up with, actually. And suddenly you've got a whole range of things coming up on your chat of those emoticons or whatever it is. And it just makes them think about the delivery in a different way. So moving on, looking at seminars. So seminars is where most of active learning actually can be used in the most creative ways, because obviously in seminars you have more flexibility. In lectures you're quite constrained in what you're doing in the actual task. And so what I will always do with all my seminars, all my modules, and I've done this for years, is besides specific readings I ask them to do for each seminar, I always allocate a specific task, something that they have to do, not just something I have to read. It can be something very basic, such as find out who your MP is, which I mean most of my students should know really. But it could be also who won the election in the 2016 election, I don't know, in Italy. I'm not sure if there was an election in 2016 in Italy, but I used to teach a lot of European politics. So one way I had to introduce students to some of the countries we're looking at was by asking them to go and find some facts about those countries. And they might have been very simple, but then they would bring those to the seminar and we would use them one way or another. It can also then become more complex. And I saw something that I can't remember now. Someone talked about role model UN role play, which there's loads of those, which are really, really complex. And so you can do in lots of different ways. So one of the things I used to do, for instance, was building up the profile of parties, and then ultimately students will actually create their own country and with their own party create a party manifesto for their party and then bring it to the seminar. So you can ask all sorts of different tasks. It's just not about reading. Traditionally we ask them just to do a reading, and I think it actually reinforces that reading if you ask them to also do something which you can then use in the seminar. And then in the actual seminar, rather than doing your traditional paper discussion and going around and asking each person about it and everyone looking back to their shoes or online, going back to playing in their game and with their camera off, trying to integrate tasks in the seminar. So that might be your breakout groups, or you discuss an idea. It might be looking at how would you address a specific problem. It might be trying to rank a particular activity. It could be so many different things, and I'll give you some more specific examples in a bit. And then what's really important, I think, is to use these types of activities across the seminar classes in a diverse way. So some of the examples I'm going to show you, I would only use them once in one seminar. I always try to do different things in all my seminars. And students really appreciate that, the diversity of activities that you might do. And it also exposes them to different types of skills. It also means that you can meet different learning needs. So some students might be very good at debating, for instance, others might be much better at solving problems than debating. So, and having that diversity across the seminar classes is really important. And applying the active learning principles to that, it also means that you can then meet different types of needs. And one of the things I usually do is I build it up as the module develops. So in the first seminars, I might do very simple things, very basic, and then I build it up. And by the end of the module, we might do a seminar, which is a much bigger role play where they all have different roles. They're all trying to solve a massive problem. But I wouldn't start with that. I would start with something much smaller. And these pictures are all pictures from my own students working on things. Another example of tasks, so some specific examples, sorry, of tasks now, flip chart work. I mean, there's so many different things, which I'm sure many of you do, that can be done with flip chart work. There's some examples there for some of my students. I had a student who used to do an octopus for almost every single activity I asked her to do. And that's why I put her flip chart picture in there. From writing a party manifesto and then presenting it, you know, not just writing it, actually presenting, making them stand up, maybe give them 1 minute to present it or 2 minutes. To doing a figurative representation of something. I've used this to apply to many things. So I've got an example there, doing a figurative representation of criteria for democracy, figurative representation for how democratic a parliament is. It can be anything you want to. And then using that creativity, it really makes them engage with the issue and talk within the group. So I've had Christmas trees, I've had cakes, I've had your standard graph, also all sorts of things, but it just makes them think a bit more about what they're doing. Outline your proposal for reform, convince a particular group of your points of view. There's many ways you can use a flip chart paper. It's just an output where they put their work, and then if they have to present it, it develops again skills of communication and trying to persuade a group of what you're trying to achieve. Mock debate, I'm sure many of you do a mock debate. Again, that's a very traditional politics initiative, but then setting up a scenario and giving rules to students. The photo that I have there is from, let's see if I remember the names, I think it was Ross and Ruth. And what they were doing there, they were actually being Portuguese communist MPs talking about their proposals to changing the electoral system in Portugal. So this was when I used to teach about the Portuguese Parliament, relationship between Parliament and citizens, and the electoral system is a closed list system. There's all sorts of implications with that in terms of constituency relationship. And what I did an actual role play of the Portuguese Parliament, which obviously I had a lot of pleasure in setting up. And we had a really good room, sort of round room, to be able to do it. And they're all given a different political group. And these two, they were the communists. And then we would do a debate about whether they would be supportive of changing the electoral system or not. So setting up a scenario, and again, this sort of activity, I would usually do it at the end of the term, because at the beginning it would have been quite difficult for lots of reasons to have it happening. Do a lineup. Has anyone used a lineup before in class? I see some people saying yes. So a lineup is basically, it can be used in lots of different ways, and it's basically telling to your students, imagine one side of the classroom is one idea, the other side of the classroom is an opposing idea, and asking them to stand up and then to line themselves up according to that polar idea. And what usually happens is that you get a big blob in the middle because no one dares to show how they think of one idea or the other. And so then what you do is, right, now talk to the person next to you and see whether you go more to one side or to the other side of that person until you have a line. And you can do that as the activity itself, depending on what you're asking them to do, what the theme is. Or you can also then use that to break them into different groups, which I use that a lot. So I use that, say, to break them into 2 groups to do a mock debate, opposing views. I also do to break into 3 groups, a group in the middle. So for instance, the picture we're seeing there, the 2 taller girls in the middle, they might have been the ones in the middle, and then you've got the group on the left and the group on the right, and you may ask the group on the left to go and work on an idea, the group on the right to work on opposing idea, then to show the ideas to the group in the middle, and then the group in the middle actually decides which one they'll go. So a more specific example, one of my classes, the whole thing is about digital engagement in Parliament. Should Parliament invest in more in digital engagement or not? So I would have one group saying, putting proposals for Parliament. I imagine like talking to the Commission in Parliament, or whatever it may be, and say you've got a pot of money, put them a plan to convince them that they should invest totally in digital engagement. And the other group would say exactly the opposite, that the investment should be all in face-to-face methods of engagement. The group in the middle would be the actual commission, the MPs, the officials in the commission, who would then make a decision. So it's a small example of how a very simple activity can be built up in something much more complex. Now, doing this face-to-face, it works really well. The students, when you ask them to stand up, they look at you as if you're a bit mad, but eventually they do it, and actually they appreciate the value of doing so. Doing it online, obviously, is much more hard work. And this year, I wasn't quite sure whether to do it, how to do it. But then in the end, I decided to try something like this. And this is just something that it's just a quick print screen, something that I did. And what I did, the way I did this lined up was by using a whiteboard. So in a whiteboard, I drew a line, and that's why you can see it's not straight, it's drawn by me, so it's all wiggly. And it was a seminar about descriptive representation. So whether descriptive representation, so having the same proportion of, say, men and women, ethnic minorities, etc., as MPs, as in society, whether that's absolutely key for representation or whether it's not that important. And then ask students themselves to write their names where they would stand in that line. And then from this, we create a whole discussion and ask, okay, Vicky, you in the middle, do you go that way, not that way, why? Esther, you in there, why? James, why? And then eventually put them into the group and then come back to with more refined ideas. So this is a way I found to do my lineup. It's not as satisfactory as in class, but it's just an idea. And I wasn't sure whether it would work that well, to be honest. And I think quite often we just have to experiment. It actually worked really, really well. And they really went for it. And then they put their names. It was really funny because as the arguments developed, they start dragging the names and changing names, putting them in a different place as they saw other points of view coming through. And still another example of a task, setting up a problem, and then asking the students to solve it or convincing others of their point of view. So this is when I divide them into different groups and I almost disappear from the seminar. And these are almost the ones I really, really enjoy. So you've set out all the preparatory work, they've done the reading, they've done the tasks, they come in, you set them specific roles, and then basically the seminar, it's them talking between themselves, and then you just wrap up with the conclusions at the end. And there's so many different ways of setting those problems and asking the students themselves to solve it. And it's really about experiential learning then. This is an example of a role play on a bill, which I have done for a few years now. And it's again just an example of a scenario. So we work usually on a bill. This year it was the internal market bill, but it could be any bill really. And I divided the students into different political factions, not parties, factions. So for instance, within the Conservatives, you've got the Brexiteers, the ultra-right Brexiteers, the ones from Scotland. You know, you can break them out in lots of different groups. And prior to the seminar, I give them the links to the bill, identify a handful of amendments I want them to look at. And that, just doing that, it makes them look at the reality of politics, trying to find these links, try to actually look at proper legislation to see how complicated it actually is, just to look at that and try to understand what it is. And I asked them to look at those bills, the bill and the amendments, and have a think according to their political faction, how they would vote for it. What would be their arguments for voting one way or another? And then at the actual seminar, they all divide into their political factions, and I've done this online also. It's exactly the same principle online. So in the online case, it would be into their own breakout groups in those factions. And then the factions have to discuss between themselves how they would vote on each amendment. And depending on what software you're using, you should be able to set it up so that students can actually go from group to try to convince the other groups to vote with them. And this year, it was one of the most fun activities I had, just seeing the students go from group to try to convince the other ones. One of my political factions were the whips from the Conservative Party, and they had a great time going to visit everyone to try to convince them to vote with them. And that's it. And then we just vote on each amendment, and then at the end vote on the bill as amended. And it's always interesting to see the differences between what they do and what actually happened in reality. So this was just to give you a more sort of detailed example of one of the activities that I do. But besides the actual lecturing and seminars, the active learning can actually use this approach for a whole module, and I tend to do that when I develop a module, I'm always following those principles of active learning. And obviously the assessment is absolutely key to any module. So my assessment tasks, they tend to always have these active learning principles behind them. Whether it was a research methods module that I did a long time ago, which was compulsory to everyone, whether it's now this module which is on the UK Parliament. And for the assignment for that, what they have to do is a strategy briefing for an MP. And that's composed of 3 different parts. First part, where they set up the context for the MP and the issue they're going to focus on. And the second part is the actual briefing. Briefing is the steps they recommended the MP to follow to pursue an issue. And then the third part, which is the longest, which is 2,000 words, is basically the rationale. Why did you advise your MP to follow that briefing, to pursue that issue? Picking up on the literature about Parliament, role of Parliament, how backbenchers now have more power, all of those things. And they choose their MP, they choose the issue, and they have to develop this across the whole of the module. And doing this online, actually, I felt it worked much better because everyone is actually going online I was using a combination of MS Teams and Collaborate for this. And MS Teams, I had threads supporting this. And right from the beginning, I was asking them, so who might your MP be? What might your issue be? And then I was asking every week for them to go and look at the MP they were choosing and checking out what they had been doing. And it's a way of engaging the students throughout the module whilst they're developing lots of skills in terms of employability, of research, etc. And so there were all sorts of activities during the whole module, always linking back to the strategy briefing. So this type of assessment makes the students work with real politics, puts them in a scenario that they have to address, whilst also having to apply the theory. So in this case of this strategy briefing for an MP, this is a 3,000 words assessment, and the first part, the MP and issue, they have about 300 words to explain who the MP and the issue is, then about 700 words for the briefing, and then the main bulk of it is the rationale, is the essay, which is 2,000 words. So it's a simple example of how to try to make them experiential, that politics, the practical side of politics, while also having to think about the literature and the theories and how to apply it. So key messages, it's learning by doing, and that's why I think it has worked so well for me. Learning by experiencing, learning by having to think about things. It's very much about being student focused. It can be applied really, really simply. It can be built up to much more complex. And I think it's also important to think beyond the class delivery and thinking about the module, the whole packet, let's say, package. Rather than thinking it just individually, something that you do in a seminar, perhaps. I haven't spoken at all about field trips and things like that, but obviously that's another side to it. But that's much more complicated in many ways. I've got a photo there of one of my class a few years ago, and I like this photo for lots of reasons. One of them is that one of the students there, Charlotte, she actually works in Parliament now, and was really inspired by a lot of the activities we did within the module to go and look for a job there. And that's it. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Cristina. That was really interesting. Be useful now, I think, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat box. And as I say, anyone who wants to kind of put their hand up, put their mic on and ask a question, you are very welcome to do so. We try and encourage our students to do so. So if anyone here wants to kind of do it, that would be really useful. But I'll start things off with a question which kind of came to me at the very beginning of your speech, your presentation. I just kind of wondered what student feedback has been generally about kind of active learning. I know in my experience, often it's very popular with students, but also for some students, they say they want to be more active. They say they kind of want to kind of have less of a kind of a lecture-based kind of delivery, but then often they kind of also want the kind of content delivered to them as well. So I just wonder kind of what student feedback had been and if there were any tensions at all.
Thank you, Dan. And I think that's a really important question, and it actually reminded me when I went from, so I taught in Hull for a very long time, and then I went to Leeds University, and they're very different types of universities, and I found it really interesting, the difference in the students, and one of the reasons was exactly that. Whereas in Hull, students were really happy to go along with my mad ideas, never questioned it, just went along and thought this was fun, I'm learning, etc., all of that. In Leeds, the attitude was completely different, because there are much more students who straight away are thinking about what do I need to get a first, or what do I need to at least get 2-1. And so they're much more utilitarian type of approach. And I felt there that if they don't know me, one of the things I need to do at the beginning is to establish that trust that I do know what I'm doing. And if I'm asking to do something that sounds a bit, mad or a bit out of what they would usually experience, that there is a purpose for that. But I think it actually takes 2 or 3 weeks to build that up, to build that trust. Obviously, the ones who then choose my finalist module, they already expect that, and they do it because, so in there, I can go straight from the beginning, because they already are ready for that. But in the first years, second years, if they haven't been taught by me before, there's always that reluctance. And so I think that there's always there, but it's about demonstrating to them that there is a purpose for it. One of the things that I think that actually sometimes we don't, we disregard a little bit, is conclusions at the end of the seminar, for instance. So if we ask them to do an activity, a scenario, whatever it may be, a lot of them might not be able to relate what's the relevance of that to what we've taught, what's the content. And so something that I'm always really careful is at the end to do a conclusion that brings everything together, the activity, what they've done, what the conclusions were, and link that back to the lecture, to the theory. Something else that I do is and again, I've done this for years, at the end of each week, I'll always email my students or put a message on the board, or whatever the method, the software might be, summarizing that week. And again, that helps to reinforce that we did a lecture and then we did a seminar because of whatever, and to demonstrate to them why we did it. There was a benefit to doing it. There was a logic to it. But I think it is important to reinforce those messages. And that it's interesting, because that end of the week summary email that I send, it's a very simple technique. It's just an email, really. But the amount of time students specifically mention that in the feedback sheet and how useful that was, just for them to understand where it was, I find that interesting.
I'll bring a question in which is linked to that, which has come from Simon Usherwood, who says, how do you work to support those students who don't feel so confident about active learning approaches? How much learning by failing do you want or tolerate?
Yeah, I think, again, that's about building that trust. And it's not just building the trust in me, but building the trust within the class. So you have to accept that some students will be very shy. Some students will just not see the point of it. And I do a number of things. I try to, if I'm doing groups, I try to mix them a bit. And again, quite often, students will know that in my seminars, if they come and sit down somewhere, they'll know. It's really funny, because by weeks 3 or 4, you can see them, they're sitting there and they're not taking the things out of the bags, because they know that I'll move them. And so you can do a lot of social engineering in that way, and trying to put them into groups where that someone in there will do it and will take the other ones. How much do I tolerate learning by failing? I think that's, I always think that learning by failing is great, because there's no better way of learning about things. So you just try things out. I think the more tricky issue there is about those who are really shy. Something that I do also is those students who haven't said a word for 3 weeks, or you can see they're really shy, but then they do a debate and they actually say something. I then, after the class, specifically mail those and say how I've noticed how good they were. I noticed that you said something and I know you're shy, or whatever it is. So I make the point of showing that I noticed it and that it was appreciated. And I think, again, that sort of builds that rapport and makes them feel more at ease in terms of the teaching.
A linked question to what you've been talking about, and also to Simon's question, has come from kind of Matthew Bergman, who asks, do you grade the active participation in any way? I guess it kind of, there's the grading of the actual outcome, isn't there? And also there's grading the actual process of being active in itself.
Yeah, very good point. I don't personally. I know there are some people who do, so there's all sorts of ways of grading intervention, participation, or grading the outcomes of those participations. So if you do, a flip chart paper, then you can analyze the flip charts. So there's lots of ways of doing it. I personally have never done that, because I'm a little bit wary of breaking down every single activity into a grade, because I think that sometimes can get in the way. But it depends a lot also on the module. So for instance, at one point I was teaching statistics, and I think that lent itself more for identifying different elements to do the grading. One of the difficulties that I have is that because I do very different things from class to class, every week we'll be doing different things, it would be difficult also to apply that overall. So instead, what I'm trying to do is develop a well of goodwill towards the module, towards the teaching, and attendance of my classes tends to be very good, and participation tends to be very good. So that's what I'm trying to do in terms of making sure they are, engaging with the process.
Yeah, it is quite tricky. I mean, I know I found in my university, obviously the Open University, we're mostly online anyway. Even in kind of normal circumstances, we do have some modules and some activities where we do mark the actual participation as well as what they are working on, the outcome. And it's actually quite difficult to do that because it's quite subjective, because deciding how well someone else participated actually is subjective in many respects. So you end up often kind of marking them in terms of kind of how much, how many times they've responded, which kind of almost kind of defeats the object, because again, it doesn't necessarily tell you how well they have taken part in the activity. So it can be done, but it is quite tricky.
Yeah. That's why I at one point I did use it for something very specific, but I think in many ways, for the way I tend to do things, I think it raises more problems than solutions. And so I try just to encourage them to participate, encourage them to be involved, and it works. But you do have to build that trust, I think. If they don't trust you, and if they don't see why they're doing that, but also if they don't feel comfortable in the class, obviously. And some groups are easy to do than others. Some groups you have the dominating figure, the person who won't shut up, and then you have everyone else. So you have to deal with all of those to build an environment where people feel comfortable to do whatever activities you ask them to do.
Talking of feeling confident, a question from Amanda Rosen has come in, which is about how we support faculty that don't feel so confident about active learning approaches. Are there any starter approaches that we can recommend for people who are trying to transition from kind of passive to more active approaches? Yeah,
really good point. Because I mean, those of us here, we are already, just by the fact we're here, we are interested and we're willing to experiment with different things, whereas a lot of people might not be. And I think it's about breaking it down to really simple things. So for instance, the examples I gave for the lectures, I can't remember all the examples I gave, but most of them, I think anyone could use one of those. And you could even say, when it comes to 15 minutes past, make sure you have a quiz, just have a slide with 4 pictures, which one is the odd one out, or something like that. So breaking it down to very specific ideas to apply, I think might be a good way to doing it. Then depends how far off you want to go, how much you want to convince the faculty about it. I have in the past, because I was director of quality for a while, sort of used the students for that. And so the students, you had like a focus group with students, and students identify how they think they learn better, how, what they find difficult to follow. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. But I always think that the more specific examples you give, the better. Because sometimes people just can't think of a way of doing it because they've always done it. They've taught 20 years in the same way, and they just can't, actually conceive of a different way of doing. And when sometimes actually they could do something really simple, which is 10 minutes in or 15 minutes in, just do a quick quiz. I mean, who doesn't like a quiz? Everyone does. Even those who say they don't, they do. I thought I didn't. And then I ended up by being responsible for doing a quiz to the Study of Parliament group. I don't know if there's anyone here from Study of Parliament group in January. And everyone got really excited about it. Even I did. And I don't particularly like quizzes. So, yeah, just give simple ideas.
I wonder if this is one instance where working online is a good way of testing that kind of thing. Maybe doing a quiz online, or doing a kind of active learning activity online more generally, it might be easier to kind of do a kind of a quick kind of tester activity perhaps than it is face to face, potentially. And I wonder if there are any kind of active learning activities which are easier online, and what we can do online perhaps that we can't do face to face. So what are the advantages? We often talk of the disadvantages of working online, but are there things that actually we can do online in the kind of active learning space which are potentially easier, or different things that we can do that we can't do face to face?
Yeah, I think so. I think online you have all the power of asynchronous teaching, all the things you can do asynchronously. Whereas if you're trying to do that face to face, it's much more difficult to engage the students to go to your VLE and engage with those activities. Whereas if you are online anyway, they're expecting all the delivery to be online, then you are in a much better place to convince them to go to those threads where you want them to engage. And at the same time also ask them to do different things at the same time, so they can choose to go for one thread or another. So one of the things that I did last term was ask students to report on their own MP every week according to the topic we were doing. So if we were covering it that week, say select committees, they had to go and check which select committees their MP were, or if there weren't any, why that might be. And then ultimately they would adopt their own MP for their assessment, and they would do that in relation to that MP for their assessment. And a simple thing like that, if I was teaching face to face, it would be very difficult to convince them to do it throughout the module. Because we're doing everything online, they engage with that really, really well. And it was interesting because I do a formative assessment before the summative. And although submissions for the formative are usually, quite high proportion of them submit. This year I had far more students submitting, but also much earlier, because they were working consistently every week on it, because everything was there. It was much more structured in many ways. So yeah, I totally agree with you, Donna, that there's lots we lose, and there's lots of things we can do face to face which are much more, successful and a pleasure to do. Also, that online is really hard. There's also, though, things we can do online that we can't do face to face, and I think using those asynchronous activities is a real plus. But also asking them to go and do things themselves, like having a shared PowerPoint slide which they can all of them be working at the same time. Again, you wouldn't necessarily do that if you're doing that face to face.
In kind of course planning, kind of seminar planning, etc., I wonder how much the issue of kind of accessibility and kind of disability has come up with some of the kind of active learning activities. Obviously, that depends what we mean by accessibility and disability, yeah. And it depends whether it's face-to-face and online, perhaps. But I just wonder how much of a consideration that has been at the kind of the planning stages.
Yeah, I think that's always a consideration. So I think I always think of those issues regardless, and that's partly why I try to have very diverse type of activities to make sure that I am meeting different types of accessibility requirements, but also different types of learning leads and whatever. Now, obviously, there might be specific needs of a specific students which go beyond that, so you have to do something beyond that. So for instance, we had a deaf student this term, and so having captions on lectures or seminars was really important for that. But something, for instance, that I developed doing thinking of my students with dyslexia who really struggle to read a lot of text, is instead of sending them really, well, I still send that like end of the week email, but besides that, I also record myself saying those things so that they are listening and watching rather than just reading. So there's definitely always that planning, always think about the different needs that there might be. And that's something, for instance, I've developed doing because of that, specifically thinking not to give students just very long text to read, but also every so often, you know, just a recording of yourself talking, I think helps a lot.
Again, that might be another example where perhaps, you know, some of the online stuff is of you know, of an advantage potentially. There's a kind of conversation in the chat box which is quite interesting, and we kind of touched on this earlier a little bit. Fatima has talked about some of her students in Southern Europe, about they don't want to get involved with any activity that's not clearly described in the course program to get a mark. And I think we kind of touched on that earlier, this notion of you know, kind of, you know, students kind of perhaps, you know, wanting to kind of have a result from their activity, if that makes sense. There has to be a kind of a purpose to their activity, and one of those obviously is you know, the actual kind of the actual grade. I just wondered if you have any kind of thoughts about kind of how to kind of perhaps address that issue, this kind of, you know, this kind of lack of enthusiasm for something which may not seen as kind of contributing towards a kind of a specified outcome.
Yeah, I think it comes back to some of the things I was saying before. It's about convincing them, explicitly showing to them the benefit of doing these activities, for instance, in terms of having an employability skill, that they are much more employable. As I use that so many times with my students, and it really, really, you know, goes into their mind, because then in the feedback sheets, I'll have that also. We now know how to do also whatever besides just doing an essay. So I think explaining that to them and summarizing that, and it's not explaining like in the module handbook having a really long paragraph about employability, is about every week doing a small summary saying, right, so this is what we did, this is why it matters, and by the way, we developed these skills. And I think doing that little by little really helps, but it has to be a little by little, and it has to be explained. I actually, I'm looking at your name, Fatima Lampreia Carvalho, and I'm wondering whether you're Portuguese, because it does sound really Portuguese. And I started my teaching career in Portugal, so I can see, I totally get what you're saying in there. I don't know if that's the scenario you're thinking about, but I think it's the same thing. It's about explaining, it's about unpicking, and actually in there I've gone back. Yeah, Brazilian but teaching Portugal, great. Yeah, that's what I thought actually. I've actually, I mean, I haven't done this for a long time now, but I used to go then I came to UK, and then I used to go every so often as a guest lecturer back to Portugal. And it was really interesting to see their reaction, because obviously they were not used to my approach, and it was difficult to get them to buy in that approach. But again, it's always comes back to explaining, making it explicit why there's advantage of doing that, from in terms of being more fun, more engagement, but also in terms of employability skills. And ultimately, actually, because then it results in a better grade. So something I always make it very explicit to my students is that it's those students who engage with all the activities that are set out for them, who start working on those right from the beginning, who always end up with the better grades. And it's so clear that it's a very easy argument to do. And something else that I tend to do also is that my assessment, because it's not an essay title, they can't specialize. They can't just come to seminar 4 and 5 or 6 and then hope that those questions will come out. They need to come to everything, because everything will matter. And again, the more you engage with all the activities, the better results you'll get. So I use all of those things to explain to them, not just explain, but to make explicit why it matters. And I think that's really important, that we explain why it matters, because they don't necessarily get it necessarily. They might have fun, but they might think, well, what was the point of that? And it's important that they understand the point of doing those activities.
I'm going to bring John Craig in here, if you don't mind, John. You put an interesting comment in the chat box about kind of maybe the impact of prior educational experiences at school. So I don't know if you want to just explain your point, and we can kind of take it from there.
Yeah, I just sort of wondered whether if in your secondary schooling you've got a more kind of hothousey intensive approach to getting the very best grades to go to, in inverted commas, the very best universities, does that lead to a more instrumental approach, whereas perhaps schools that take a slightly more rounded view of education perhaps involve students in more activities, perhaps send students to universities who are more willing to kind of try things which are new and experimental. So it could be that the kind of for want of a better term, the elite going to the elite universities actually are more conservative in terms of their teaching learning expectations, which might account for what Cristina was saying, maybe partly just between Leeds and Hull as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so, totally. It was really interesting the transition from Hull to Leeds. I mean, geographically, it's the same area of the country, but they are very different types of universities. And I really felt that students who went to Leeds, because it's a Russell Group university, they were very focused on getting the best grades, best A levels to get into the university. There's quite a few students come from private schools, but it's not just necessarily a private school thing. It's about the students who understand what they need to do, what are the tick boxes that they need to tick to get those grades. And being myself mum of 3 boys, very different personalities, where my older one is definitely not one of those tick boxes, you know, it's just more the comprehensive perspective. And looking at his friends who are the sort of tick boxes, it's really interesting to see that. And I do feel that it does come from their school experiences and how they approach teaching. And if any of you got school children in secondary schools, you'll know that they'll do the work and they'll get comments on every single thing they get in terms of what they need to change to get the grade C or the grade B. And it's so instrumental, I think. It's so particular, it's so specific, that then it's really difficult to university to change that and to explain, actually, being a first class student or 2-1 class student is not about all the different knowledges or the different things. It's about much more than that in terms of understanding of politics. But I think that's definitely there. Can I do Stephen's question, Donna? Stephen is asking, any particular activities recommend for the dreaded Monday 9 AM slot? And no, but what I would say is definitely make them move. Well, for one thing, if they're there, they're actually pretty good, aren't they? It's not every student that goes on a Monday 9 AM slot. But I would make them move. I would really make explicitly the effort of thinking of activities to make them move, even just for the sake of moving. So, right, you sat there, so you're going over there now, and maybe even do that a couple of times. Because more seriously though, I think it is important to think about what you do at different times, because you need to be able to take that into account. And that's why I think being flexible about the approach for seminars is really important in terms of what you'll do with them. And yeah, the Monday 9 AM or the Friday afternoon when they really don't want to be there neither. Or, as I've had many times, you're trying to give them a seminar, but something big is happening in Parliament and they're all on their, you know, they want to know what's happening, and you're thinking, well, actually, that's really good. So maybe trying to use that instead of trying just to do the seminar regardless might be better.
And I think as well, I mean, I know in my experience, you know, the difference between, you know, kind of introductory kind of, you know, year 1 students compared to kind of year 2 and 3 students often can be quite stark in relation to how confident people feel and how much they're kind of feel able to kind of get involved and speak to other students, and also to kind of, you know, to work with the tutor. Doesn't mean you can't do active learning with them, but the kind of the types of active learning activities might be different for a new student perhaps compared to a more established student. And there can also be, you know, there can be big differences just in different seminar groups, you know,
yeah,
and it can just be down to the personalities of the students, the personality of the tutor, a set of other circumstances or issues which have come up and you have to kind of react to them, which means some activities will work really well and some will fall flat. And you know, and if that happens, you have to kind of react to them and make changes, etc. So you do get a feel for it. Also, you know, that things can happen, which means you have to kind of, you know, rethink things and have a backup plan. I think is always a good one. If something's really interactive, I do like to have a backup plan just in case something happens and I can't get the participation because you know,
yeah, or if the students don't attend for some reason, you know, something happened and you need 2 groups of 6 people, but actually only 6 people turn up, and then it doesn't work with it. So you really have to think on the spot and try to change things, because so many things can happen that you have to adapt.
I think we've probably had our last question now, because it's a couple of minutes to 3 o'clock. I think we pretty much answered most of the questions in the chat box. But if anyone answered and anyone has any kind of questions, please you know, post them on Twitter to the PSA Teaching Twitter. We'll keep an eye out, and I'm sure Cristina will. She follows us and keep an eye out too. And we can answer you online. Anything else which comes up you want to kind of ask, feel free to kind of post it online, and we'll be happy to answer. I want to say thank you to everyone for coming, and I want to say thank you in particular to Cristina for such a great session. Always such a fantastic support to the PSA Teaching and Learning Network. The recorded session will appear on the website shortly, and so please do keep an eye out for that. And if any of your colleagues couldn't attend, please pass it on to them. And then spread the word about the webinars that are open to anyone to attend, whether a PSA member or not. And the next session is on Tuesday, the 23rd of Feb at 3 o'clock, hosted by Victoria Honeyman from Leeds, on the things we have gained during lockdown, what we won't miss and what we should incorporate into our teaching in the longer term. So that's our last webinar for this particular series, but we will of course be planning some more activities in the future. If you have any ideas or want to be involved, please tweet us or send us an email. So once again, thank you very much to Cristina, and thanks very much for coming. Have a